The cabin was quiet except for the low thud of luggage being stowed overhead. Then the pilot appeared. He didn't stop at the cockpit door. He walked straight down the aisle, his eyes locked on me, each step deliberate, like he was heading toward a problem only he could fix. "You need to move out of the VIP seats," he said, voice flat but edged with authority. No explanation, no apology, just the kind of tone that dares you to argue. I didn't move. The ticket in my hand was valid, my seat assignment clear. But the air between us tightened as passengers nearby turned to watch. His jaw shifted. He repeated himself, louder this time, so the entire cabin could hear. For a moment, we stood there in silence, me in my seat, him blocking the aisle, until a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, like he thought he'd already won. What he didn't know? By the time the sun set the next day, his airline would be scrambling for answers it wasn't prepared to give. Before we get into what happened, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a true story that matters. And drop a comment telling me the country you're watching from, because stories like this deserve to be heard everywhere. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only I could hear. And that's when I realized this was about far more than a seat. I'd spent years learning how to keep my voice steady when others tried to shake it. In my world, every meeting room, every negotiation table was another proving ground. It didn't matter that I ran one of the largest freight logistics companies in the country. To some people, my skin tone would always walk into the room before I did. That morning had been about business, not conflict. I was traveling to finalize a major shipping agreement with an international partner, a deal that could open up an entire new trade route. I'd left home before sunrise, coffee in hand, mind already on the numbers and strategies I'd be presenting. The first class wasn't new to me. It wasn't a luxury I stumbled upon. It was a necessity for the kind of travel schedule I kept. I'd earned every mile, every upgrade, every seat. Yet every so often, I'd catch the glances, the ones that seemed to ask, "Are you sure you belong here?" Boarding had been uneventful. My ticket was scanned, my luggage stored, my seat, premium, spacious, exactly where it was supposed to be. Already waiting. I'd just begun scrolling through my notes when I noticed the flight attendant's hesitation. She looked at my ticket twice, then at me, then disappeared toward the cockpit. I told myself it was nothing. But when the pilot walked out moments later, heading straight toward me, I knew I was wrong. He didn't ask about my ticket. He didn't inquire if there was a mistake. He told me to move. Not to another VIP seat, just out of it entirely. His voice wasn't just firm, it carried the weight of someone certain they'd be obeyed without question. I stayed seated, my expression calm, though inside, the familiar burn of injustice stirred. Around us, passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from moments like this, a weariness built over a lifetime of being challenged in spaces you've rightfully earned. I could have argued. I could have shown him the printed ticket and pointed out my name in bold letters. Instead, I met his gaze and let the silence speak for me. That was the first moment I saw it. A flicker of annoyance, maybe even disbelief, that I hadn't immediately complied. And in that instant, something settled inside me. If he wanted to turn this flight into a public test of belonging, he was about to learn how costly that test could become. The boarding process dragged on, every new passenger shuffling past with a curious glance toward my row. I could feel their eyes linger, not because they knew who I was, but because they were watching an exchange they didn't quite understand. The pilot had stepped away for now, but the atmosphere around me hadn't relaxed. The flight attendant reappeared, this time with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We may need to reseat you," she said, avoiding a direct explanation. The words were light, but her posture told another story. Hands clasped tightly, shoulders slightly forward, as if bracing for my pushback. I kept my voice even. "This is my assigned seat." I tapped the printed boarding pass on the armrest, my name clear as day. Her smile thinned. "Yes, but we have certain arrangements for VIP seating." She glanced over her shoulder as though someone was monitoring her delivery. I didn't ask who the VIP was supposed to be. The answer was obvious from the way she shifted when a tall, white man in an expensive but rumpled suit stepped into the cabin. His eyes slid over me briefly before he stowed his bag and stood waiting in the aisle, waiting for me to move. The attendant leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He's one of the captain's guests." There it was. Not a paying customer with a ticket like mine. Not someone who had gone through the same process. A guest. And in their minds, his presence meant my seat was suddenly negotiable. I sat back, crossing one leg over the other, and returned my gaze to the documents on my tablet. If they wanted me out, they were going to have to say it loud enough for everyone to hear. That's when the pilot came back. His stride was quicker this time, the controlled patience from before replaced with something harder. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist you relocate now." The hum of boarding paused. Even the flight attendants further down the aisle stopped moving. Passengers froze mid-step, heads turning like they'd stumbled into a live drama. "Is there a safety issue with my seat?" I asked. My tone even, eyes locked on his. He said, his voice rising, "It's reserved." "For who?" "That's not your concern," he replied, the words landing heavy in the air. Somewhere behind him, the white man shifted, clearly expecting to take my place as soon as I stood. The pilot didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on me, as if this was a contest he refused to lose. Inside, the irritation was sharp, not just at the insult, but at how routine this felt. I'd seen it before, the quiet replacement of someone who didn't fit the image they wanted in a certain seat, a certain room, a certain place. The longer I stayed seated, the more restless the pilot became. He took a step closer, closing the gap until I could smell the faint scent of jet fuel on his uniform. "We're not going anywhere until you move." The murmurs around us grew. A woman across the aisle pulled out her phone. Another passenger further back was already holding his upright, recording. I slid my boarding pass into my bag slowly, making sure the passengers watching could see it. "Then I suppose the delay will be on your record, not mine." That single sentence made something in his expression flicker. Anger, yes, but also surprise. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting. He straightened, turned sharply, and spoke into his radio. I couldn't hear what he said, but I didn't need to. Whatever came next, the entire cabin was about to see it unfold. The flight attendant returned first, her voice sharper now, the mask of politeness slipping. "Ma'am, the captain is asking one last time for your cooperation." The word cooperation hung there like a warning. The kind people use when they want compliance without discussion. I stayed still, meeting her stare. "I have cooperated. I boarded. I followed every instruction. I'm in my assigned seat." The white man still lingered a few rows away, checking his watch, clearly confident that the outcome was already decided. A few passengers whispered to each other. Others kept recording, their phones angled discreetly but unmistakably toward us. The pilot appeared again, this time with a crew supervisor in tow. The supervisor wore a blazer and the strained smile of someone who had been told to handle the problem. She bent slightly toward me. "Let's take this conversation to the front, okay?" "No," I replied, my voice even. "We can have the conversation right here." Her eyes darted toward the man waiting for my seat, then back to me. "You've been assigned a new seat in economy, row 21. A ripple of discomfort moved through the nearest passengers. One man muttered under his breath, "That's messed up." The supervisor's smile faded. "If you don't move voluntarily, we'll have to delay departure." I leaned back, clasped my hands loosely in my lap. "If you delay, that's on you. I have a paid ticket for this seat, and I intend to use it." The pilot's patience broke. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "You're being disruptive." Disruptive, that word. It had been thrown at me in boardrooms when I questioned bad deals, in conferences when I pointed out double standards, and now here, because I refused to give up something I had every right to. Before I could respond, the supervisor gestured to a ground staff member who had just boarded. He stood there awkwardly, clearly caught between authority and embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said, "please gather your belongings." I stood, not because I agreed, but because I understood the game they were playing. This wasn't a negotiation. They had decided I would be removed, and the longer I resisted, the more they'd paint me as the problem. As I stepped into the aisle, I caught the eyes of a few passengers. One woman mouthed, "I'm sorry." Another man shook his head in disbelief. Phones followed my movement down the narrow walkway. They didn't escort me to another premium seat. They walked me all the way to the back, into a cramped row where the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and the armrests were scratched bare. When I sat, I could still see the pilot at the front, laughing lightly with the man who had taken my place. That small exchange said everything. They were comfortable enough to make a joke out of it, but while they thought the matter was settled, I was already considering my next move. Every slight, every word, every witness in that cabin, it was all part of a story I intended to tell. And this time, the telling would have consequences they couldn't predict. The plane touched down with the usual jolt, but the sound of the landing gear was drowned out by the hum of passengers unbuckling too early, eager to escape the recycled air. I stayed seated, letting the row clear. It wasn't about avoiding anyone, it was about taking a moment to keep my expression neutral. As the man in my original seat stood to leave, he glanced back down the aisle. The smirk was still there. Behind him, the pilot's posture remained easy, shoulders loose, as if the last 2 hours had been just another routine flight. Before we get into deeper truths, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a true story that matters. And drop a comment telling me the country you're watching from, because stories like this deserve to be heard everywhere. When the cabin emptied, I stepped into the aisle, collected my bag, and walked off without a word. No confrontation, no scene, just a straight path to the terminal, the click of my heels the only sound I focused on. In the privacy of the arrivals lounge, I pulled out my phone, not to scroll through social media, but to open my company's secured communications app. I typed one short instruction to my executive assistant: initiate a compliance audit on Aero Global Airways, passenger treatment, crew conduct, and incident logs from flight AG2147 today. Flag priority. She didn't ask why. She knew my tone when a line had been crossed. This wasn't about one bad flight. It was about a pattern, a belief that certain faces could be moved, replaced, or downgraded without question, and I wasn't going to let it slide under standard procedure. By the time I left the terminal, the first responses were already coming in from my legal department. The airline's freight division had a standing contract with my company, one worth millions annually. That contract included clauses about mutual reputation and conduct, clauses I had personally insisted on. At the curb, my driver opened the door. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, catching a trace of the tension in my shoulders. "Not yet," I said, sliding into the seat. "But it will be." The city moved past in flashes of steel and glass as we headed to my hotel. My phone kept buzzing. Internal memos, policy excerpts, and the beginnings of a paper trail that could dismantle the kind of arrogance I'd witnessed that day. Some people handle these things with loud statements. Others handle them in rooms where decisions cost millions. I had no intention of shouting. I was going to make them feel the weight of every passenger they had dismissed before me. The image of the pilot's expression stayed with me. The assumption that I'd quietly comply. The certainty that my removal would go unchallenged. Those assumptions had taken root over years, maybe decades in his world. By nightfall, the first formal request for the airline's internal incident report was already sent. It was signed not by me, but by my company's compliance director, on official letterhead that made it clear the matter was corporate, not personal. The pilot had wanted me out of that seat. Now, he was about to learn what it felt like to be moved from him. By mid-morning the next day, the ripples had already reached the airline's upper floors. I hadn't spoken to a single journalist, posted nothing online, and made no public comment, but the right people knew. An email chain forwarded to my office told me everything. "We have a compliance request, high priority. It's tied to a VIP seating incident yesterday. Captain involved. This could affect the freight partnership." The freight partnership. Those two words carried weight. Our shipping volumes filled their cargo bays every week. Losing that business wouldn't just dent profits, it would open the door for competitors to swoop in. By noon, more internal correspondence landed in my legal team's inbox. A statement from a junior crew member described exactly what had happened. The captain said the woman didn't look like a VIP passenger and told me to find out if she'd upgraded herself. There it was, in writing. Not a misunderstanding, not a seating mix-up. An assumption rooted in who they thought deserved to be in that seat. The compliance officer at the airline flagged it immediately as a reputational risk. The head of public relations was looped in, followed by the operations director. By the time my assistant read me the latest update, their internal tone had shifted from confident to urgent. We need to speak directly to her. What does she want? This has to be resolved before it goes outside the company. I said nothing in response to their outreach. Letting them sit in the silence was its own form of message. They were used to customers pleading for action. They weren't used to someone holding leverage over them quietly. That afternoon, one of my industry contacts called. "They're nervous," he said. "The rumor is you might pull your cargo contracts." I didn't confirm or deny it. "They'll know my decision when I make it," I replied. The racial bias wasn't up for debate, it was documented. What came next was deciding whether they'd simply apologize and bury it, or whether they'd face a reckoning big enough to change the way they treated every passenger who didn't fit their picture of a VIP. For the first time since stepping off that plane, I allowed myself a small smile. The pilot had looked at me and seen a seat to reclaim. The airline was about to see the cost of taking it. The call came less than 24 hours after the flight. Not from a customer service rep, not from a department manager, from the CEO of the airline. His voice carried the forced warmth of someone used to controlling the narrative. "I wanted to personally apologize for your experience yesterday," he began. "It doesn't reflect our values as a company." I let him finish, but didn't return the courtesy with polite small talk. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to ensure it never happens again, to me or to anyone else who looks like me." There was a pause. What would that involve? I didn't hesitate. A full independent audit of crew conduct, focusing on passenger treatment by race, gender, and perceived economic status. Mandatory anti-bias training for all flight and ground staff. A written acknowledgement of misconduct in my case, issued to every employee involved. And removal of the pilot from passenger service until the investigation is complete. He exhaled audibly. "That's extensive." "Not as extensive as the damage you'll face if this becomes public while I'm holding your freight contracts," I replied. My tone wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. The weight was in the words themselves. I heard the shuffle of papers on his desk. "We value our partnership. You value the money. And that's fine. But now you'll also value the people you serve, whether they're in economy or your most expensive seat." Silence on the line. I didn't rush to fill it. Finally, he spoke. "I'll have our general counsel draft a compliance agreement reflecting your requests." "Good," I said, "and I'll expect to review it within 48 hours. By the time the call ended, my assistant had already scheduled a follow-up meeting with my legal team. The message was clear. This wasn't a settlement. It was a structural change. Later that afternoon, one of my senior managers forwarded a news link. The headline read, "Airline faces internal bias investigation following VIP seating dispute." Anonymous sources confirmed a high-value corporate partner was involved, though my name wasn't mentioned. In our industry, anonymity doesn't last long. Calls started coming in, from other CEOs, from journalists fishing for confirmation, from advocacy groups who'd fought for years to highlight discrimination in air travel. Each time, I gave the same answer. "I'm not making public comments until the audit is complete." That wasn't just strategy, it was control. They'd already stripped me of a seat. They weren't going to strip me of the timing and framing of this story. As evening settled in, I thought back to that moment on the plane. The pilot's voice loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, telling me to move. Now somewhere in a corner office, he was the one waiting for orders. Orders that might end his ability to treat passengers like pieces to rearrange at will. The power shift was in motion. And for once, it wasn't hidden behind closed doors. 2 days later, the airline's internal email system was buzzing like an open secret. The compliance audit had been formally announced, not as a quiet HR matter, but as a company-wide memo. It didn't mention my name, but the language was unmistakable. All flight crew and ground staff are required to participate in immediate review sessions regarding customer treatment, with particular attention to issues of race, gender, and economic status. Incidents will be assessed and disciplinary action may follow. For the employees who'd been there that day, it wasn't just another policy update, it was a warning. By the afternoon, the business press had picked it up. Headlines varied, but the core was the same. Airline launches bias audit after VIP seating incident. Some reports hinted at the freight partnership at stake. Others quoted unnamed insiders about a high-profile executive being the passenger in question. I didn't confirm any of it, but I also didn't try to bury it. The truth was moving on its own, and every retelling carried the same weight. A black woman had been told in public that her presence in a premium seat was negotiable. Inside the airline, not everyone took the memo as a sign of progress. Anonymously, a flight attendant reached out through my assistant. "I saw what happened," she wrote. "It wasn't the first time I've watched someone get moved because they didn't look right for the seat they paid for." She ended with, "Thank you for not letting it slide." That was the part the public wouldn't see. The smaller voices now feeling they had permission to speak up. Meanwhile, the pilot involved had been reassigned to non-passenger duties, pending investigation. The man who took my seat? Silent. But silence can speak volumes, especially when it's not backed by the same authority it once had. At a shareholder briefing, the airline CEO fielded a question about the audit. He kept his answer brief, but the shift in his tone was noticeable. "Our commitment to equitable treatment is non-negotiable," he said. A phrase that might have read as hollow months ago now carried the shadow of the incident that forced him to say it. Watching from the outside, I knew this wasn't resolution. It was only the beginning. Policies can be rewritten in a day, but culture takes longer to change. And I intended to watch every step of that change. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been in this position before, looked over, second-guessed, quietly shifted to the margins because someone decided I didn't fit. But this was the first time it happened when my title alone could have stopped most people in their tracks. I'd navigated boardrooms with executives who couldn't hide their surprise at my presence. I'd walked into industry dinners where my name was on the guest list, yet the host still asked for proof I belonged. But the cabin of that plane was different. It was smaller, more public, more immediate. The kind of space where every eye watches, where humiliation is part of the tactic. After the audit became public knowledge, messages began filling my inbox. Some were from people I knew. Most were from strangers. "You gave me the courage to file a complaint," one woman wrote. "Last month I was moved out of business class for weight distribution while a white passenger took my seat. I thought it was just me." Another message read, "I've been there, and I wish I'd had your composure. They count on us being too tired to fight." Each one felt like a reminder that this wasn't just my story. It was a chapter in a much bigger one. It would have been easy to walk away quietly. I had other battles to fight, other contracts to close, other deals on the table, but silence would have turned that moment into just another unchecked act. And every time that happens, it tells the next person, the next crew, the next passenger, that there's no consequence for it. That's why speaking up matters, even when you could easily leave it behind. Especially when you could leave it behind. The truth is, racism in air travel isn't always loud. It doesn't always look like yelling or slurs. Sometimes it's a polite request delivered with the certainty you'll obey. Sometimes it's a decision made in a cockpit or crew room based on a glance. Those moments don't make headlines unless someone refuses to quietly comply. And systemic change? It only happens when enough of those moments are exposed, stacked together, until the weight forces a shift. The audit was still ongoing, but I knew what was already changing. Crew members were thinking twice before deciding who fit in a certain seat. Passengers were watching more closely. People who'd been silent before were now speaking up. For me, the impact wasn't just in the policy memos or the press coverage. It was in the awareness that, for once, the story hadn't been buried. The humiliation they tried to stage in that cabin had been turned into an investigation that might stop it from happening to someone else. And that, more than any contract or apology, was worth holding my ground for. They thought they could move me from my seat. Instead, they moved the ground beneath their own feet. That day was never just about a chair in a premium row. It was about the quiet rules some people think they can enforce. The unspoken belief that certain spaces are theirs to decide who belongs in. To the passengers who held up their phones, who didn't look away, who knew the power of a record button in the right moment. Thank you. You didn't just see it happen, you made it harder for them to deny it. And to the ones who carry themselves with dignity under fire, who choose not to match humiliation with rage but with presence, know that your restraint is not weakness. It's strategy. It's the strength that unsettles those who expect you to break. Every time we speak out, every time we refuse to be shifted to the margins without reason, we make the next attempt harder to pull off quietly. That's how change starts, not in grand speeches, but in moments where someone decides they've had enough. Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it, and so do the people who need to know they're not alone. If you believe respect should never depend on skin color, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. The more voices telling these stories, the fewer people will have to live them. And remember, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's the quiet voice that changes everything.